Well, it's an absolute joy and a privilege to welcome to the Fifth Direction Dr. Ed Tick. Ed and I guess, first came together during the Minnesota Men's Conference in the pandemic times when they moved online. So lucky enough for me in Australia, I was able to join that. And Ed was one of the faces on that grid, and I listened to some of his words and was immediately feeling a connection there. And afterwards, Ed, you reached out to me and with some thoughts about Australia because you were coming to visit your son and the impending birth of your grandson. And we connected in that way, which was probably a bit over a year ago now, if I'm right. Mm.
Yes, that I
Yeah.
was there, and we connected. Yeah.
Mm. So, firstly, Ed, welcome to the Fifth Direction.
Thank you very much, Asher. I'm honored to be with you, and hello to all of our brothers and sisters who might listen to this later on. And I want to honor our shared motivation to help bring the world together this way and talk globally all around the world about issues of spirituality and health that concern us all. So honored to be with you and share with your community.
Well, thank you. And for those that don't know, Ed, Ed's many decades of work as a depth psychologist, as an author, as a poet, and most recently has released a new book, Soul Medicine, which we'll talk about a little in a moment. But really, what you're mainly concerned with is really bringing into the modern world the Greek healing wisdoms, which were practiced by Asklepios. And I'd love for you to maybe talk a little bit about, well, firstly, maybe just your origin story, how you came to this work so many years ago, and then maybe introducing us to Asklepios.
One of my areas of specialization is working with war survivors, especially veterans, people who have survived combat, and looking for the best possible holistic ways to bring health and healing back to them. And so then in 1987, I had been working with veterans, primarily Vietnam veterans, for about 10 years. I began right at the end of the Vietnam War, which was 75. And of course, down under, you have this population as well. And as you said, Australia tends to follow the US in good and terrible ways. And that was one of the terrible adventures both of our countries had. I knew very much by then about the Greek warrior tradition and the citizen warrior tradition, and that how differently service was in the ancient world, how people served for life. It wasn't a job. You didn't get paid. You had to supply your own weapons, your own food, your own clothing, and everybody was in the National Guard. And when they were needed, everybody had to go into service. And they had profound period of preparation. In the US, you get 6 weeks of basic training. In ancient Greece, it was 2 full years before they let anybody near a battlefield. And they also had profound ways of bringing people home and healing the traumatic wounds of war. So I went to study that and experience it as much as I could. And the third important step, I would say, in getting me on this particular healing path and learning about Asklepios and ancient Greek healing was that back then in 1987, I went to Epidavros to attend the opening night of the ancient theater festival they have every summer. Now, Epidavros it's on the Peloponnese, about 3 hours from Athens, and it was the largest, most important healing site in the ancient Greek world. I didn't know it then in 1987. I didn't know why the theater was there. I was going for the theater. And I sat in the front row of their magnificent ancient 14,000 seat theater, which still has nothing mechanical, no modern audio devices to project the voices, but you whisper on stage and it can be heard way up at the top row. And I'm so happy to say this. Scientists haven't been able to discover how it works yet. It's been really heavily analyzed with all of our modern equipment, and we don't know why this works, but it does. Anyway, I went for opening night, and that year it was The Trojan Women, which is a play by Euripides. And by the way, again for our audience, all of the great Greek tragic writers, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, they were all combat veterans. Sophocles and Euripides were elected generals in the Athenian army. That too, in Athens, people elected the men they would follow into war. They weren't appointed over them. Gotta love each other if we're going on this terrible adventure together. So the Greeks chose the leaders they, for better and worse sometimes, but they chose and elected the leaders they would follow. Greek tragedy was created by combat veterans for collective social healing of war trauma. Most of the Greek tragedies, well, they're all tragic, but most of them consider war either in part or fully as their theme, and most of them have warriors and traumatized warriors in them. So tragedy was invented to be a communal sacred ritual for catharsis after war and other forms of violence. So I went to see the anti-war play, and that night of theater changed my life in several ways. One matter was that at the time I had been working with Vietnam veterans. Viewing that play, I didn't understand with my head. I felt with my whole being that war itself is an archetype, and it's wrong or limited to just focus on one particular war with its history and its politics and its sociology, but rather I'm working in an archetypal dimension where the archetype we're trying to deal with it is war itself. So I went into that theater thinking of myself as a psychotherapist for Vietnam veterans, and I left the theater saying, no, this calling is to respond and heal for all warriors of all times and all places, because in essence, on the archetypal level, they're all the same. All wars are the same, and all people who suffer the traumatic wounding of war are brothers and sisters who survived the same hell. So I left the theater with a new identity and realizing that I was called to branch out beyond Vietnam. Like the Vietnam War is my training ground for working with warriors from any conflict. So that was one major transformation. A second was, I can feel it even as we talk. Hecate was the queen of Troy, and so she's the protagonist, and then the Trojan women are the chorus, and they're all crying and screaming and reciting a magnificent poetry, lamenting all of the costs of war to them. Their city is being burned, all of their men are dead, the children are being killed, and the women surviving and the little children that are left are being taken off and to be slaves. So all of the wounds of war are screamed in penetrating poetry and staging to the utmost. And during the play, there's a point at which the Queen of Troy screams out, anathema, anathema, anathema. That is an ancient Greek word, anathema, against the theme, against the order, against the way of life, against the logos, against the order of the universe. She screamed from the core of her being. I heard, I felt, I can feel it now. And this is how many years, decades ago, I can feel her scream in my body. And Right? She was letting out the anguish of the soul after experiencing so much destruction, which also reinforced what I was understanding, that what we call post-traumatic stress disorder is a soul wound, not just a stress and anxiety disorder, certainly not, and not just broken brain, as modern researchers and many therapists are claiming. It's not the nervous system. Essentially, the nervous system is transformed, but really it's a profound wound to our soul. And from there, everything about us changes, everything. So it was also the soul wound dimension of the war experience was also revealed to me. And I then asked the question, how come I saw this at the major healing sanctuary of the ancient world? And what's the relationship between tragedy as a communal healing ritual and the rest of medicine and healing as it was practiced in the ancient world? So that led me into what's now become a lifelong quest and service to understand and learn to work with and bring back for us as much as possible the Asklepian healing tradition. And so what is that? That's the last part of your question, I think. And again, for our friends who aren't aware of this, I am working in, and you do too, and how we share it, we are together working in the spiritual and mythic archetypal origins of medicine and psychology in the Western world. Both medicine and psychology came from the Asklepian healing tradition in ancient Greece. It began, well, what we know, the first records we have were from about 14 or 1500 BCE, and it lasted into 500 CE. So it lasted for 2,000 years before it was crushed, suppressed by early Christianity. It is a holistic healing tradition, and it is a spiritual healing tradition. So, and we're talking about Epidaros, but there were, we know of over 320 holistic healing sanctuaries all over the Mediterranean world, not just in Greece, but from Egypt to the Iberian Peninsula, and from Europe down to the southern part of Northern Europe. So Italy and Bulgaria, today Romania, Bulgaria, the Caucasus Mountains. This tradition was there. I have visited ancient Asklepian ruins there in Bulgaria, and all the way down to the northern coast of Africa. So a huge part of the ancient world knew of and used this tradition, and used it extensively and well. Now, this is the origins of medicine and psychology. Our modern words in English come from this tradition. You and I love language and what it reveals. So psychology, psychotherapy, psychiatry all come directly from this tradition. And it also reveals some of the ways that we've lost the path to healing because of how we use the words today. So if we go back to origins, psychology does not mean the study of the mind as people are taught today, but psyche means soul in ancient Greek. And logos, logi doesn't mean study. Logos is the logos, the order and meaning of the universe. So psychology, if we approach it correctly, what you and I will argue is the correct approach, is we are trying to restore the order and meaning of the soul. Psychiatry also comes from this tradition. Again, psyche is soul, iatros is doctor. So a psychiatrist in the ancient world was literally a soul doctor, not a medication dispenser, as tragically most of them have become today. Psychotherapy also, therapeia means to serve or to attend. So a psychotherapist is a servant of the soul. And for all of our friends listening, if and when you need any of these services, please remember these definitions. And when you're sitting with a helper, really feel in your being and ask yourself, do I feel a soul connection with this helper? Is he or she hearing me deeply and talking to my soul so that we can engage on the deepest level? Now, Hippocrates, who we call the father of scientific medicine, he was born on the island of Kos, which is just a mile off the Turkish coast. He was raised in an Asklepios sanctuary. One of the biggest and most important of the ancient world was also on Kos, and his father and grandfather were Asklepios priests. So they raised him and initiated him in the tradition. And he didn't practice sacred medicine himself, but he believed in it. He referred to it, and he said, these are Hippocrates' words: all illness begins in the soul and ends in the body. Right? He also said that we develop our illnesses by committing small sins against the soul over a long period of time until they accumulate in us, in our being, and eventually, when we've accumulated as much as our being can tolerate, that's when they break out into an illness. So the origin of the illness is the soul, and we have to go to the soul and the original soul wound to heal it. And this tradition had ways of doing it. So what we need to know for now about this healing tradition is that it was profoundly naturopathic and holistic. So the Asklepios sanctuaries had, and some of our holistic healing sanctuaries today are partially modeled on this ancient model in having a lot of holistic and naturopathic practices for healing. So the sanctuaries, they had massage therapy and acupressure and astrology readings, and of course tragic theater and nutrition and gymnastics and psychotherapy, and we'll talk about their dream therapy in a moment. They had all of the holistic practices that we have today. Differences to our modern sanctuaries is that when you went in there, you didn't pay. You gave donations for the healing when you left afterwards. And everybody was welcome. It was the perfect, you guys do better in Australia than we do in the US in having a universal healthcare system. But this was the perfect universal healthcare system because it was free to everybody. Everybody was welcome and received it. So even though it was a patriarchy and women were oppressed, women were equally welcomed as men. And even though it was a slave society, everybody was welcome, slaves as well as emperors. And if a slave could only give an apple after a healing, in God's eyes, that's a lot. And that was fine and accepted. So everybody was welcome. Everybody was offered the healing practices. Also, different from modern holistic centers, everybody got every methodology of healing. You didn't go to the center and say, oh, I'm signing up for a week-long intensive acupuncture course or meditation course. No, you went and you got everything, and you got it for as long as you needed it. And that wasn't even the core of the healing. The core of the healing was really going so deeply into soul space and through dream work. After people were in the sanctuary for a long enough period of time and it went through all of the holistic and naturopathic practices, either a dream or a vision or a synchronistic event or something would tell them they're being called into the God's chambers. It's time to do what the Greeks called enkimesis, is translated as dream incubation. It's similar to the walkabouts. You leave society and you go out into the wilderness to encounter the spirits and gain spiritual wisdom and connection. And hopefully you come back transformed, touched by spirit, given earth wisdom and transformed in your being, so that you're not going through a long, torturous adolescence. You've gone through your rite of passage and you come back matured. The Native American vision questing is similar as well. Go into the wilderness and fasting and praying and with nothing to protect us, and putting ourselves before the universal powers and waiting there for a vision or a dream or some kind of strange natural event that gives us the vision and tells us spirit heard us and gives us an answer. In the dream incubation practice, earlier on, before the classical era, people went into the mountains and they slept in caves. So it was pure earth medicine. As Greece developed and the classical era came and they built all those big, beautiful buildings that all of us like and honor, then the sanctuaries became very extensive healing sanctuaries. And people went into the healing sanctuaries for their dream incubation. There was always a building reserved for nothing else but the incubation. It was the holiest of holies, the place never to be trespassed for any other purpose or for any profane reason. So people went into this building called the Abaton, and they fasted and prayed and laid down on what the Greeks called a klinikos. So our word clinic comes from this practice as well. So they lay down on the clinic, just waiting, sleeping, dreaming, waiting, meditating, praying until what Jung would call a big dream came to them. Not the everyday kind, but a big dream or vision in which, in that tradition, the god Asklepios or any of his helpers, he had 3 daughters, they were also all healers, and they also had their own sanctuaries and did dream incubation as well. But so the god Asklepios, any one of his 3 daughters, or one of his spirit animals, primarily the snake, but also the dog and the rooster, the cock. So all of those came in dreams and visions to people. Not the only ones that came, but most commonly they came in the Asklepian tradition. And in a dream or a vision, people would either be healed directly in the dream. For example, a warrior who was blinded in combat and there was no medical cure for his condition, did dream incubation, and he was told in the dream, Asklepios appeared to him in a dream and told him to go to my altar and gather ashes from the sacred altar and mash acorns into acorn flour and make a poultice of these 2 and spread it on your eyes and your vision will be restored. And it was. It was. Another healing of blindness. There was a woman, this is one of my favorite healings from the ancient world. You'll hear why. So the woman's name was Ambrosia. She was blind in one eye. So she went to a sanctuary looking for healing, but she made fun of it. Even in the sanctuary, she scoffed. You can't be healed of blindness from a dream. This doesn't happen. You're putting me through this process and I'll do it, but it's dumb. Well, she went to sleep in the sanctuary. She had a dream in which she saw Asklepios come to her. And in the dream, not in physical reality, but in the dream, she saw Asklepios cut open her blind eye and pour ointment in and told her, also gave her the message, this will heal you and you will have your sight restored on one condition. Are you willing to fulfill my condition? She said, you're going to give me my sight back? Yes, yes, spiritual master. What do you want me to do? He said, after your healing, you have to gift the sanctuary for the healing. I want you to set up a silver pig statue in memory of your stubbornness and stupidity because you didn't believe in me and that you would be healed. And her sight was restored, and she really did set up the pig. And we know this because this healing story was inscribed on the pedestal of the statue. So these really happened. We have about 1,000 testimonies like this from the Asklepian dreaming tradition that stretched over these 2,000 years that tell these kinds of stories and how that it really happened, and even to well-known people. The Emperor Marcus Aurelius, many of us know his Meditations. An amazing book. He testifies to 2 Asclepian healings he had in this tradition in Meditations. And emperors gifted buildings so that the sanctuary could take apples from slaves because Marcus gave them a building. Sophocles, the tragedian, was considered to be a special friend of Asklepios because we were told that he had a dream incubation healing in his home. Like Asklepios made house call to Sophocles and gave him a healing. And so Sophocles wrote a famous prayer, a hymn to Asklepios that was inscribed and set up on the Acropolis in Athens. So there's lots of evidence from the great and the humble people that this tradition worked. And I've experienced it myself. I have an earlier book called The Practice of Dream Healing, and I tell a story. I'll share now this. I was teaching an adult education class on this tradition, and there was a medical doctor in the course who scoffed, like ambrosia. Can't happen. This is ridiculous. One of these testimonies said that a woman was pregnant for 2 years and didn't deliver, and then she went into the sanctuary. The Asklepios taught her how to deliver, or delivered her. Can't happen. Doesn't happen. This is so unscientific. Ed, how can you prove to us that any of these things really happen? Okay. Well, I took the question home. What am I going to tell this doctor that this tradition really did happen? These are not myths in the sense of fantastic stories. They're mythic historical events that really happened and enter into our mythological heritage. And Greece has the word, by the way, you'd like this too. Greek has the word mythistorema, one word, mythic history. And you and I work on reclaiming our mythic histories of our illnesses. So that week after this doctor doubted the stories, and I was contemplating what am I going to tell him in our next class, I have irritable bowel syndrome, and I was diagnosed with that in my 20s. So, and nothing healed it. I manage it through careful diet and exercise and such, but I've had it. A couple of nights after this confrontation from the doctor, I was sleeping in my bed at home, and yes, Asklepios makes house calls. I had a dream that night that a doctor walked into my bedroom, clothed in a robe with curly hair and a gray beard, and he looked like this doctor friend, except he was dressed like a Greek, and he was carrying the caduceus. He walked right up to the edge of my bed and looked down on me and said, "I hear you've been calling me." Yes, Lord, I have been. Well, here I am, and I've brought you a healing you've been asking for. What is that? What should I do? All in the dream. And Asklepios, my dream Asklepios said, I want you to take an enema, make an enema of vinegar and lemon juice, and take it. And it will contribute to healing your digestive tract, where for your whole life, like your family and generations before you, you put all your pain and your stress into your gut. Remember, your mother does that. Remember, your grandmother does that. You come by it honestly, and this can relieve some of that conditioning. And so he smiled and he bowed to me, and I thanked him, and he walked out. The next day, I called the doctor and I told him what happened. And he laughed and said, I've never heard anything like this. But I guess you've got to do it. Now you're our guinea pig running this Asklepian experiment, so do it. So I said, well, yes, doc, thank you. Any reason I shouldn't? And he just said, If I were you, I would dilute your lemon juice and vinegar with some water, because otherwise you're going to burn yourself going up the rear. So just reduce the acidity, but do it. And please tell us what happens. So that night, I set up an altar in my bathroom to Asklepios. I put a statue of Asklepios there, and I had candles burning, and I burned sage or incense, and I had snakeskin and other representations of Asklepios, and I did the enema. And I immediately felt, how do I describe it? Like my body was suddenly and immediately infused with divine energy. And it was like the acid burned off bitterness and anger and other toxic emotions that I've accumulated in my guts, in my digestive system over my whole lifetime. And it was like I was the acid in my system was being burned off by the acid of the Asclepian remedy that I was given. And I felt so light and unburdened and flooded with joy from that experience. And it remained with me for a long time. And honestly, it did not completely heal my IBS, but it significantly improved it quite a lot. So it became intermittent instead of chronic. And I also go back and use this healing practice every now and then when I feel like my gut, and more importantly, my spirit needs to burn off some accumulated toxins. So and the doctor who doubted then came to Greece with me twice and deeply studied this tradition. And he actually, it transformed his doctoring because he became somewhat of a medical philosopher and wrote some really good articles on what holistic and naturopathic healing is and could be, in contrast to our mainstream practices. So it changed his philosophy and his doctoring and woke up his spirit as well.
That's amazing.
So that's a long answer to your complex question. Thank you.
Yeah. No, I set that up, but I also appreciate you, setting the foundations of where you came from and how the work has even transformed you personally. I feel like there's a lot of threads I can pull on from what you've just said there. It seems to me that the Asklepian experience, certainly in dream incubation, seems to work in these two ways. Either there's some form of almost spontaneous healing that happens from the dream, or else there's a set of instructions. This is the prescription. Now go do. It seems to be that there's these two.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's either the treatment directly in the dream or the prescription for the remedy that you need that you have to go do. And those were the two characteristic ways that the dreams worked in ancient times. This is really curious as well. In the Greek era, the dream incubations were more commonly direct healings in the dream. In the Roman era, Rome brought Asklepios to Rome during plague as well, and he was beloved in Rome as well. But in the Roman era, the remedies were more commonly prescriptive. It could be different interpretations, but my own is, I think from Greece to Rome, people got more distant from spirit, from the gods, and they became more official religion and mechanical worship. And so we're taking prescriptions instead of direct encounter with the deity.
That sounds about right. And maybe we've continued to move in that direction ever since,
Exactly. So
right. Disconnecting us further and further from soul, perhaps.
Yes, disconnecting us from soul and disconnecting body from soul. And we love words, you and I. So let's even pick on words without meaning offense, but trying to help us get back on the right track. Most medical professionals do not, forgive me, do not earn the title of doctor. Doctor doesn't mean physician. Most medical they're all physicians because they're treating the body, the soma. Doctor actually comes from the Latin, and it meant an educator, a scholar.
Mm.
And tragically, very few of our modern physicians are doctors.
Mm.
They don't. They have physiological understanding and awareness, and they know how the body or their specialty works, but they don't have the larger holistic vision. They don't talk to our souls. They don't seek with us the origin of our distresses. And as we both know, most of modern medicine is just symptom control, not deep healing.
Mm.
Plato even warned against this. So this is not new. Plato said most people mistake the consequences for the causes, and they mistakenly treat the consequence and never get down to the cause. So nothing really changes.
Mm. Yeah,
So you can
feel that.
eliminate a nightmare, but what created the nightmare? What is in your soul that's so disturbed that's sending you these messages through your dreams?
Yeah, and I think the instruction always is go and find out, which generally involves a descent of some kind, which we'll
Right.
get into soon enough, I'm
Yeah.
sure. But there's one thing that's been sitting with me since you began speaking, and that is this idea of war as an archetype. And for me, what I hear in my own personal experience, having never been to a physical combat like that, is that as well as an archetype, it's also a metaphor for life, is it not? I've got a friend. Yeah, I've got a friend of mine who's done many tours of duties, and he likes to say we're all veterans of something.
Yeah.
And so for me, like I in your origin story, you began working with Vietnam vets and so forth, and now that's sort of extended to everybody in a way. And I feel that metaphor of war that kind of underlies all of that is really pointing us to all wounds, all illnesses, all diseases.
Yes. Yes. Plato also said, always be kind because everybody you look at is having a harder struggle.
Yeah,
Everybody.
yeah,
And if we continue to share the metaphor, utterly true that every one of us in some version feels like we've been up against the guns, facing forces of destruction that can harm us or even take our lives. And you've been through your version of being up against the guns and facing mortality with all of the fear and horror and blessing and teaching and urgency that brings. So yes, war is a metaphor, and not only the physical and political realities that we suffer.
Reminds
And
me of
even more, that's also built into Greek philosophy. Heraclitus, the famous philosopher of change, people know him by saying he's famous, we can never step into the same river twice. So that's one piece of wisdom. But Heraclitus also said, war and Zeus are the same thing. And he said, war is father and king of all. And what he meant is that not that the universe is purposely violent, trying to kill everybody, but that strife, the clashing of opposites, is a universal condition, and it's always necessary, and it always brings the cycle of creation, preservation, destruction that we are endlessly in our individual and collective lives. And that's the way what he meant. War, strife is built into the universe. And we human beings tragically replicated in the way we practice war, but that's not what the universe meant for us to be doing.
No, I love that. There's also something very Jungian about that everything is a pair of opposites, isn't it? So
Yes.
the very act of living and to dance between those is strife.
Yes. So We agree. It's a universal condition, and in early times it was worshipped as a goddess.
Well, we can get into Aries and Athena and things like that as well when we start talking about the archetypal energies within war, and that leads me to something else too, because for me personally, the fifth direction began as an entity called Warrior Within. And the reason that we called it that, looking back to my early days there, was it was all men at that time. We hadn't yet invited women into the community. It was very specifically men's work, and it seemed to me that the warrior archetype was the thing that we should be focusing on. And it seemed to me that a lot of men's work was entirely focused on the warrior archetype. And so I guess I'm wondering what you have to say about that.
Oh, I fully agree with you, and I express my gratitude to the men's movement for that focus, for introducing us, and for attracting so many non-military, non-veteran men into the movement to learn about and focus on their own warrior archetype. And I agree with you that the early men's movement, especially, was heavily focused on the warrior within, though there are other archetypes. For years, we overemphasized the warrior. And veterans did come into the men's movement, some, and felt at home there because they were welcomed and they were honored as warriors, and they could come in to our community and do some of the healing of that archetype. So they weren't isolated and alienated, and that helped counteract the traumatic wounds, because the horrible homecoming that both countries, yours and mine, have given our warriors is a major source of a traumatic disorder. And for you and me and those most of the men in the men's movement who had not been in the military, we felt something lacking in ourselves. We have to unfold the archetype. And if we don't, it's not that we're okay and nothing happened. It's that when we miss a significant piece of our development or spiritual practice, it causes a wound, or there's a hole in us. And so veteran men were overexposed to the shadow of the warrior, and non-veteran men were not exposed to the warrior and didn't develop their warrior archetype at all, and were really feeling weak. And so the men's movement profoundly helped hundreds, thousands of men to develop their inner warrior and to free it from that requirement that it should be military experience, and to give us rites of passage and initiations that mainstream society wasn't giving us. So for all those reasons, those years or decades of the men's movement focusing on warriorhood was really essential. And you and I think, can agree that we need to bring in all of the archetypes, and they ultimately also need to be balanced. The warrior needs the king and the magician and the lover. And ideally, we're in the center of our being, drawing from all of those powers and manifesting them in some kind of unity and integration.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly with all that, and it's interesting that Bly and co, even his early workshops, and then leading to Iron John, was actually all predicated on what he felt around the Vietnam War, both before, during, and after. So there is this kind of proximity of the warrior archetype to all of this work, anyway. And I think for most men, we feel some form of the warrior maybe earliest in our lives in terms of the archetype coming through. I think was it Bly who said it was sort of like warrior first and then maybe lover in the second half of life, and maybe the reverse is true for women.
Robert Moore's books, King, Warrior, Magician, Lover, really focus on that Bly and they're in the same camp, but that's correct that the Jungian and archetypal circles tell us that the warrior awakens first in the male developmental cycle. So really, we can't stop the boys from playing guns. We can't. They need to. So in the developmental pattern in males is warrior, magician, lover, king, and in females it's lover, magician, warrior, queen. And it helps explain some of the, not just the gender differences we struggle with, but also how men develop their animal side first and earlier, and it needs to be developed and nurtured and trained. And men often don't come to settle into intimate relationships until later on in life when the adventure is burned off. And women, this is difficult in our good feminist age where so many women are gaining power as well. But at least in the archetypal perspective, the teaching was that women develop the lover first. And so they are oriented and biologically oriented toward mating and bonding and reproducing. And after that life process, so many women find their power afterwards. I've been a mother, I've been a partner, I've done that part of my womanhood, and now that's done and I'm free. And here comes the warrior woman, here comes the Amazon in the more mature years. So it's also very helpful for men and women in our gender conflicts to have this dialogue between the archetypes. Which archetype are you in now? Which life stage are you in? Which archetype is dominating you? And how can we help our archetypal spirits be compatible and get along as we actually pass through different psycho-spiritual developmental tasks?
Yeah, I'd agree, and I know for some of us listening, you know, when we get into these gender discussions, you might find everything we've just said there a little oversimplistic. We've been a bit codifying the archetypes, but at the same time, I believe it's so important just to set those foundations as a way of understanding. I mean, clearly there's a lot of complexity within that. I'm sure you'd agree, Ed. But I still think it's important to set some pillars down like that, so we can kind of look at it, you know.
Yeah. If we all, if we take the first step in agreeing that there really are archetypes, they are living forces in the psyche and in the universe, and they live through us. If we just start there, then we can have spiritual dialogue together about where we are on our spiritual journeys and how we can best understand and support each other, rather than being in gender war about who's right or who's wrong or which archetype should dominate.
Dare I say it, in strife, which as
right.
we know is very wounding to the soul. Yeah, I agree completely. And I guess what else I find interesting in this discussion, sort of moving slightly along, is just the way you go about this work. And I know that, you know, for the last 30 years, you've been taking people on essentially pilgrimages back to Greece and back to the very origins of where all this material we're talking about it began or originated. And for me, so I guess what we're feeling into there is the idea that to heal, that pilgrimage needs to be undertaken, whether physically or spiritually.
Yes. I consider pilgrimage to be one of my most important healing practices. So as you shared, I'm leaving next week for my next trip to Greece to do some more writing, and then I'll be leading my 23rd pilgrimage in Greece at the end of March. And I also, as you well know, lead pilgrimage to Vietnam, and I've led 19 there. So 42 pilgrimages so far in my adult career, and they're extraordinary. They're extraordinarily powerful healing and growth practices. Pilgrimage is one of the most ancient forms of healing that we have. Humanity has been on, well, ever since we left the jungle and crossed the mountains and went far and wide to find what we need, humanity has been on pilgrimage. There's so many versions of pilgrimage as a healing practice, but the essence of leaving the common and the ordinary and going either internally, externally, or both, but going on a long uncharted voyage to have to encounter life at its deepest and most raw dimensions, and traveling with urgent questions for to seeking our destiny, or seeking healing of something that we haven't been able to heal, we haven't found human solutions to, and going to a distant sacred place, again, externally, internally, or both, and practicing and waiting and seeking there until some answers are revealed, is pilgrimage. And I love doing it. And well, Scout's honor, as we say on this side of the world, I don't know if you use that phrase, but I have seen people grow and heal. First of all, heal things that, again, that no human solution had been found for some people. I've seen people do like 10 years of growth work in 2 weeks. They change so much, truly, truly change so much in the 2 weeks that we're on pilgrimage together, and come tortured with questions about, I don't know how to heal myself or my family or my child, or I don't know what I'm supposed to do with my life. And they go home flooded with joy and having received really significant answers that satisfy their souls.
And you've got some wonderful examples of this, Ed, in your book Soul Medicine, which I'm so enjoying reading. It's the real life examples, isn't it, which really kind of drive it home for you.
Yes. Yeah. And we both affirm we need story. We are story, and we need each other's stories. And story, because story is experience, and experience is really what teaches us and guides us and heals us, not head stuff.
No, absolutely. And
Jung said that too.
Yeah, there were two burning questions which came up just listening to that last piece that you expressed. And one is, well, not quite sure which one to go with first, because they're both I'm feeling into both. But I guess one is around this idea of, you talked about the external or the internal pilgrimage. And it made me cast my mind back to what you were originally talking about, with the arrival of these deities like Asklepios and his daughters. One of them is called Panacea, if I'm not mistaken, and that's very specific. I like that. But nonetheless, a question, and others listening may be thinking as well, is are these figures, are these answers, are these solutions arising from within me, or are they coming from a collective sort of archetypal pool that we're all tapping into?
Oh, thank you, my friend. I love that question. And I'll tell you, because I love giving this answer, it doesn't matter. I mean, people even ask me more literally, do you believe that Asklepios is a god and that he's somewhere up in the universe, on a spiritual mountaintop, and that these figures really exist as they are, as they were presented to us? And my answer always is that it doesn't matter, because whether it's generated from the deep psyche, or whether it's generated from the universe, the impact is the same. We need to have the experience and the encounter. That being said, also, and I know we share this too, the farther in we travel, eventually we come out into the universal. Or the farther into the universe we travel, we eventually come inside into the soul. So ultimately, they're connected and they're the same, and the question disappears. But we're limited beings who have to ask questions like this. And so my answer is, it doesn't matter. It comes from really deep sources, and these types of practices access the collective.
No, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. I recently had a couple of dreams. One dream I had some words in Swahili, and another dream I had recently had words in Pashto. I don't speak either of these languages. I don't know them. I haven't been exposed to them. I woke up and I remembered the words and I looked them up, and they fit perfectly in the dreams I had, and perfect for the messages that I was being sent. So to me, that's personal empirical evidence through the experience that we descend into the collective and we access pieces of awareness, of wisdom, of vision and image from it that we bring back into our ego consciousness. So yeah, we get there to the other side in our dream life, in our visions, and then we come back into this life, but carrying a piece of that universal awareness with us.
Mm. No, that's lovely. Yeah. And on to the second question that was coming up for me, and that is this idea. I was struck by the idea of your pilgrimages back to Vietnam, and I'm making the assumption here that you take vets with you on those expeditions, or at least some vets will go back. That would be fair to say, right?
Especially this.
Especially vets, I imagine so. So for me, there's something there about the kind of experience of actually going back into the underworld for the second time for healing.
Oh yes, oh yes. There's a Greek word katabasis, which means the descent to the underworld. So, and anabasis is the ascent and coming out and coming home, and the katabasis is the descent. And it's throughout mythology that different versions of the descent are necessary. Orpheus going down to bring back his beloved Eurydice, Odysseus and Aeneas both trying to get home from the Trojan War, and they couldn't get home until they went down to Hades and received instructions from the underworld. Hercules went down to the underworld. There's so many examples, and they were mythic structures for the sacred practices. So not only in the Asklepian tradition, but also there is an Orphic tradition where the katabasis was practiced and the supplicants recreated the descent of Orpheus down into the underworld. Also, the famous Eleusinian mysteries, the mysteries of Demeter and Persephone. People went by the thousands for 2,000 years. They went to Eleusis. They walked from Athens to Eleusis, and for 9 days, they studied the myth and they experienced a descent into the underworld as Persephone had done, and what it was like. They experienced themselves dying. And the key spiritual lesson in that tradition was to learn that the body dies, but the soul is immortal. So overcome your fear of death, because the spiritual, the part of you is going to be here in some form forever. And there's very much testimony, again, also from major figures that they practiced this and it worked. Plutarch was this beautiful letter of consolation that he wrote to his wife when their little girl died while he was away from home. And he reminded his wife that both of them were initiates of the mystery, so they know the soul is immortal. So, of course, we miss our beloved daughter and grieve her, but don't grieve too much, because somewhere, somehow, her soul and her spirit are still existing and with us. So it really did help people overcome the fear of death. And in one ritual in Greece, not in an Asklepian sanctuary, but it was on one of my pilgrimages, we used a remote cave that has been used since Neolithic times, at least 25,000 years, for a ceremony. So we climbed a mountain, then we descended into the cave. We were in a version of the underworld. And during that experience, I experienced myself dying, experienced my body dying. And like the Greek tradition, I overcame my fear. And my experience was, death is not frightening. It's sad because we're leaving what we love and people and things we love. And it's lonely because we have to do it alone. but it's really not scary. It's just the change of state. And so even in the Greek tradition, I had a profound ritual that also gave me that lesson about the immortality of our spirit and overcoming my fear of physical death.
I feel
So
like,
yes, catabasis, the descent is necessary. And we descend every night in sleep. So we can use our sleep. We can, people can incubate themselves at home. I guide
yeah,
people to do that. Yeah. And so you can do the descent in your own bed, in your own home, your own way, in your own time, and go down and gather the wisdom that you need and return with it.
yeah, it's beautiful. We're actually looking at some Sumerian myths next month, and I'm immediately thinking of Inanna talking about the descent there, which is another great example of that. But it seems to me, Ed, like there's um, the two descents, if you will, are very different, because the first one we go down, we're almost dragged down, and it's quite violent and aggressive, and maybe that's where we were traumatized in the first place. And hence the fear of wanting to go back into that the second time, but it's necessary. But we go back willingly of our own accord, in a completely different kind of way, isn't it? It's more poetic, I guess, when we were a little more heart first, rather than kind of being dragged, kicking and screaming. And to me, that's
Uh,
where the healing happens.
yeah, right. It's the choice that we are joining our will to the descent so that it becomes a voluntary pilgrimage, a voluntary journey down that we're willing to make in order to get back into our origins and into the source of our wound, rather than a forced descent where pain or violence are imposed on us and we don't want to be there, and we're just trying to get back to the light where we would be safe.
Mm. And I guess
So
that's one of the signatory marks of catabasis versus anything else, in that it's voluntary. It's a conscious descent.
yes,
Mm.
yes.
Yeah, no, I like that a lot. And I guess, again, turning to your book, Ed, for everybody listening here, I can't recommend it highly enough. This book, Soul Medicine. In fact, I'm going to read its full title: Soul Medicine: Healing Through Dream Incubation, Visions, Oracles, and Pilgrimage. So you can see a lot of the themes that we've been discussing here sort of coming out in the title there. But I just have to say, this, in reading this book, it feels like a sort of culmination of all your decades of wisdom and experience kind of coming together on the page, and it's an absolute delight.
Thank you so much. I was intending that, so
Well,
I'm glad that it happened. And I'm more peaceful with my life because it's it's recorded, and I've
mm,
given it to the world the best way I can. And so I'm not ready to die. I have more work to do, but if I had to, this gives me great peace because what I've experienced and studied and struggled to bring back can remain for anybody who can find it.
well, I'm going to be strongly recommending it amongst the peers in our community. That's for sure. One of the things. Well, I love many things about this book, but one of the things I like is um, how many of I guess I would call mentors of mine you call upon. There's Hillman, there's Jung, and what you're really doing is kind of almost, there's a certain timeless quality about the book, because you're standing those figures alongside, Plato and Socrates and others, and they all, it almost appears like they're all in the same room together having a conversation, and I like that.
Isn't that? Thank you for receiving that. Yeah, they're all in symposium together, and
Exactly.
we join them. Yeah,
Mm, mm.
and Homer said in the Odyssey, "Symposium is the flower of life."
I like that a lot. So we get the word symphony, I guess, is a certain harmony that occurs between all the voices.
Right. Yes.
Mm. No, I like that, and also, I have to say, Ed, I'm so honored, to have my own story included in the book. So I guess we have to touch on that.
Well, yes. Let's touch on that. Thank you for your contribution. Thank you for permission to use it and share it with the world. But most importantly, bless you and thank you for your own journey of reaching the end of what conventional medicine could do, and you having the wisdom to say, no, 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 I'm going deeper. I have to go into the archetypal, the mythic dimensions of this and see what my affliction is saying about me, about the way I've lived my life, and what I can change to help preserve my life. So you did it. You did the journey that we're sharing with our friends. And so you also are a role model for living this way and healing this way.
Well, thank
So
you, brother. No, thank you, brother. And the other gift that you gave me too is to actually shed some light on, because obviously, you know, I feel as if my own bio-mythic journey has been, you know, traveling alongside Janus. And once we got to talking, I realized that you knew an awful lot about Janus. And so for me, you know, just having those conversations was very revealing. And the lovely thing is, you weren't specifically speaking to me about my, you know, illness, as it were. You were just talking to me about Janus, and it was helping the healing process, you know, to understand about that, you know, a little bit more about the gates of Janus, and you pointed me in a lot of really interesting directions.
Good. And that's another principle of the ancient holistic healing is, and another mistake modern physicians too often usually make. Talk to the person, not to the illness. Who is the person that this illness is visiting? Not what is this illness and how we get rid of it. So yeah, so we talked person to person, heart to heart, soul to soul, and I'm so glad that it contributed to your evolution.
Oh, absolutely. And you know what struck me as simply marvelous also has just been that so many of the let's call them clues have actually been present in the external world. It wasn't like I had to go in to find a lot of this stuff. The symbols were already there. You know, Jung would have a lot to say about that too. But you know, just you know, finding the name Janus in the medical terminology that was, you know, attributed to my illness and things like that. There just seemed to be so many markers in my external world as well as my internal one.
Yeah. If I had been smart enough at the time, I wasn't, but when diagnosed with irritable bowel syndrome, I might have paused and say, irritable, irritability, irritated. Okay, look inside at my life history and ask about that as a constant presence in my life that I need to be dealing with and cleansing. So yes, the clues are all there, and we need to wake up to them.
Yes, and you know, even indigestion in general, Ed, you know, I feel like particularly now in this culture, we're asked to take so much into our bodies and leave it there, dissolve it, you know, whether it's trauma or whether it's, and some of those things are quite frankly indigestible. You know, we talked about some of the ways of the world right now, and some of these things are indigestible, but we are asked to bring them in like a rock and digest them. And I immediately think of Cronus, who, you know, ate a rock and created the pantheon. So, you know, for me, there's this idea that, you know, the indigestibility in life, those things we find indigestible, are actually an invitation to get creative.
Thank you. I have chills because you just gave me great hope. Because we are in an age of Chronos being devoured, and these things are indigestible. And the hope you gave me was reminding me of that necessary part of of strife, the destructive process that has to happen, and we have to experience these things as undigestible and recreate a world without them. And so you just brought us to the edge of hope that is indicated by the worldwide catabasis that we're in.
Well, thank you, brother, for opening up the space for that to come through, you know. But it just shows, doesn't it, that there's so much material for us to work with when we look at our lives mythically.
Yes.
And once you begin at least for me, and you have many, many more decades of being on this mythic journey than I, but for me, it seems to get easier. Like it's almost like you learn the language of the soul a little bit more, every day. And you start to see these synchronicities and these symbols that have been shown with more, it just becomes an easier process, less clunky.
It does. Yeah, it becomes natural. We learn to think as we learn to live mythically, think mythically, experience mythically, and trust it. And yeah, the life is so much more navigable when we're living mythically and meaningful. We know we're on the path we're meant to be on. It's not random. It's not accidental. We are encountering and communicating with the cosmos in some form, and we belong. We're part of it.
We are, and for those listening, whether you've got a chronic illness or not, or even if it's just some ecological angst or just some that gnawing in your gut you might feel just about the state of the world in general, it's all this movement towards opening yourself up to a mythic life is so it's part of being human, frankly, at least the way I see it. And I'll ask you while we've got you, like aside from obviously reading your book, which I would highly recommend, where do we start? Where do we start?
You mean collectively? Where do we
Well,
start?
let's look at both. I was talking about the individual with that question, but maybe it bleeds into a larger view.
Okay, well, where do we start? I'm going to start by referencing Jung again, and also Rollo May, who was a wonderful humanistic psychologist. Both of them said, if you want to study psychology, don't start with psychology. They both said, drench yourself in spiritual studies and the humanities and spiritual and artistic studies, and drench yourself in the humanities, because the humanities are the repositories of all our cultural images. And that's what you need to know, to ingest, to really make your own. And then, just as you said, Asher, later doing the psychological work becomes easy, much easier, because you've got all the stories and the images and the symbols to draw on that might reveal in yourself or to others. So we need to stop. I don't know if this is happening in Australia, but in the US, in college curriculums, they're killing the humanities. They're throwing them away, eliminating them, saying, we don't need that. We just need technical education. And people are becoming more and more dehumanized. So drench ourselves in the humanities, restore the humanities, lots of money for the arts, and all forms of artistic and expressive practice and education, and begin at the beginning. Raise your kids that way.
No, I love that.
So that's one place we need to go.
I'm thinking of Wordsworth, Ed. Wordsworth, which is something to begin.
Yeah.
It's simple as that. Like you almost you can't fail, or you will necessarily fail.
All right. Or it's not a failure. If it doesn't work, you've learned this doesn't work. Move on to something else. The famous story about Thomas Edison inventing the light bulb. Right?
Yeah.
You failed 1,000 times, Mr. Edison. No, I never failed once. Each what you call failure brought me closer to my answer.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
I know more about how not to do it than anybody else on the planet.
Right. Yes. And that's something we have to learn also, how not to do our lives, because so much of what we're taught and programmed to do is not good for ourselves, each other, or the planet. So we need to unlearn so much.
Yeah, the unlearning. Maybe that's a beautiful place to stop, Ed. I'd love to have you back. So maybe we can, to be continued, perhaps.
Let's say that. I'd love to. I'm happy to see you anytime, my friend. And besides that, we're happy to share with your community. And to all of my friends down under, I'll be there visiting and maybe even living someday. So I'm happy to meet you and be with you this way. And I look forward to more time together with you, Asher. Thank you.
Thanks again, Ed.
Delicious conversation. Thank you very much.